AMD's new Radeon RX 5600 XT graphics card is now available, but how does it compare against Nvidia's RTX 2060? I've compared 15 games at 1080p and 1440p resolutions to help you decide. Just a few days ago, Nvidia announced that the price of the RTX 2060 is dropping down to $300, an obvious move to compete with the upcoming 5600 XT, which will be starting at $280. It's yet to be seen how many models of 2060 will actually lower down to this price though, but the Founders Edition and a few others are available for $300. AMD also made an interesting move that you may not have heard about. When the 5600 XT was announced recently at CES 2020, the specs listed it with a 150W TDP and effective memory speed of 12GB per second. A few days ago, I received a BIOS update for the Sapphire Pulse, which increases the TDP to 160W with higher clock speed and memory to 14GB per second. So essentially, they're overclocking the card. While this may sound great because it's essentially free performance, as this was a late change, I'm thinking it's likely that if you buy a retail card early on, you'll probably need to apply the update yourself, as presumably these things were with retailers ready to go before the update was available. It's also not clear yet which models will get the update, because if you have an entry-level 5600 XT that doesn't have adequate cooling, then it might not be possible. It's a pretty weird situation, and I wouldn't be surprised if the mess results in some reviews showing lower 5600 XT performance than others, as they're kind of splitting it into two different specs. I've done all of my 5600 XT vs RTX 2060 comparison testing with the new BIOS update in place, but we'll also check out performance with the old BIOS later so you can see the difference it makes. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5GHz on all cores in an MSI Z390 Ace motherboard, along with 16GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory and dual channel. You can check the links in the description for details on all of the components as well as for up-to-date pricing. Testing was done with the latest Windows 1909 fully up to date and with the latest versions of Nvidia and Radeon drivers available at the time of testing. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the results. Call of Duty Modern Warfare was tested in campaign mode. I've got the 1080p results on the lower half of the graph and the 1440p results towards the upper half. In this test, it's a win for the 5600 XT, which was scoring around 3% higher average FPS over the 2060 at 1080p, increasing to an 8% lead at 1440p. It's a different story in control. This time the 2060 was coming out ahead of the 5600 XT. In terms of average frame rate, the 2060 was 6% faster at 1080p and 10% ahead at 1440p. Red Dead Redemption 2 was tested using the game's built-in benchmark tool, and the 5600 XT was back in the lead here, granted only with a slight 1.6% lead at 1080p, increasing a little to 3% at 1440p. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode, and was another win for the 5600 XT, at least in terms of average FPS, as the 2060 was ahead in terms of 1% low performance, so less dips and a little more consistent. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and the results were very close here, with the 2060 just a single frame ahead of the 5600 XT, at both 1080p and 1440p resolutions. Apex Legends was tested with all graphical settings at maximum, and this game really seemed to prefer the RTX 2060. At 1080p, the 2060 was almost 5% faster, and this rose to a bigger 10% boost at 1440p. In terms of 1% low performance, at 1080p it was the same with either card. Then at 1440p, there was a nice 11% boost with the 2060. Borderlands 3 was tested with the game's benchmark tool, and unlike the last game, this one seemed to really favor the 5600 XT. At 1080p, there was a large 16% higher average frame rate on the 5600 XT, lowering a little to a 13% lead at 1440p. Fortnite was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay file used for all testing. This was another win for the 5600 XT, which was 6.6% ahead of the 2060 in average FPS, increasing to a 10% lead when we step up the resolution to 1440p. PUBG was also tested using the replay feature, with the same replay file again. I've found this game to preference the green team in the past, and that was no exception here. At 1080p, the 2060 was 6% faster than the 5600 XT in terms of average FPS, lowering a little to a 4% lead at 1440p. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested using the built-in benchmark. The results were extremely close together in this test, honestly, within margin of error territory without an obvious clear winner. The Witcher 3 saw some interesting results. The average FPS was higher with the 2060 in my test, however there was a larger improvement to the 1% low performance with the 5600 XT. Ghost Recon Breakpoint was tested using the built-in benchmark, and the 2060 was ahead again in terms of average FPS. Granted, the difference was quite small, with just a 1 to 2 FPS lead over the 5600 XT. There was a bigger difference noted in the 1% lows though, where the 2060 saw bigger 7 to 8% gains. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, so while not quite the same as actual gameplay, it allows me to perform the same test pass more accurately, which is ideal for comparison purposes. At 1080p, the 1% low results were very similar. However, the 5600 XT had a 5% higher average frame rate, increasing to an 8% boost at 1440p. Rainbow Six Siege was tested with the game's benchmark tool. The results were a bit strange here. At 1080p, the averages were almost the same, with a higher 1% low on the 5600 XT. But then at 1440p, the 2060 now had better 1% low performance, and also with a 4% higher average frame rate. But in the end, I doubt you'd notice these differences when actually playing. I've tested CSGO with the Uletical FPS benchmark. Because that one time I didn't include it, people got mad. The 5600 XT was clearly ahead in this game, with a 10% lead at 1080p, rising up to the biggest improvement out of all games tested at 1440p, with a 20% higher average frame rate. Over all 15 games tested, the RX 5600 XT was just 1.7% faster than the RTX 2060 at 1080p. As you can see though, it really depends on the specific game, but out of this selection that I usually test with, the 5600 XT was winning more than it lost. In many games, the results aren't actually that far apart. I think you'd have a hard time actually noticing a practical difference in many cases. At 1440p, the average improvement seen with the 5600 XT increases slightly to 2.2%. The results at this resolution varied more so than at 1080p, with some games like Apex Legends and Control favoring the 2060, while Fortnite, Borderlands 3, and CSGO really seemed to prefer the 5600 XT. Despite the 5600 XT performing better in the majority of games, the 7nm architecture seems to be more power efficient. I've tested a couple of games. In The Witcher 3, the 2060 was actually outperforming the 5600 XT in terms of average FPS. However, in Call of Duty, the 5600 XT was performing better. But in both instances, the system with the 5600 XT installed is using less power from the wall. As both cards have different cooling solutions, I haven't looked at thermals, as it would be less of a fair comparison. Now for the final difference, the price. You can find updated prices linked in the description. At the time of recording, the RX 5600 XT is launching at $280, while Nvidia recently lowered the price of the RTX 2060 to $300, which is around 7% more money. As we've seen, on average, the 5600 XT was performing better in most games. Granted, it will depend on the specific game, but it was doing this while using less power than the 2060, but perhaps more importantly, we're getting all of this for less money too. So it's looking like a nice all-round win for the 5600 XT. To be fair though, I don't yet know the actual price of the 5600 XT Pulse I'm testing with here. I wouldn't be surprised if the $280 price point is for entry-level cards that aren't capable of the BIOS update to boost performance. However, this is also the lower end of the price scale available for the 2062. A benefit the RTX 2060 has is, well, right there in the name, RTX. If you care about ray tracing, you're currently out of luck with AMD's options. Despite the first RTX cards launching in 2018, we still only have a handful of games with the feature, but this is expected to increase in the future. In my personal opinion, ray tracing is meant to be a cherry on top. Something you use when you're already using high settings to make things look even better. But when doing this on the 2060, in many cases performance does get reduced significantly. So often you'll be using RTX with lower graphical settings, which to me doesn't really seem worthwhile. It varies by game, but for actually getting good performance with many titles with ray tracing enabled, you'll probably want to look at the 2070 or 2080. Purely with ray tracing in mind, I wouldn't personally consider the 2060, but that's just me, so I wouldn't factor it in when picking between these two options. By the time it's more widely available, we'll probably have better performing hardware from both AMD and Nvidia than the entry-level 2060 experience. If you care about ray tracing, then between the 5600 XT and 2060, the 2060 is your only real option. However, as we've seen, it costs more, uses more power, and doesn't perform as well on average in the games I've tested. Before we wrap up, let's take a look at how the 5600 XT performed before the BIOS update. I'm not sure if all cards will have the update available, so this data may or may not be useful. In Red Dead Redemption 2, we can see that with the old BIOS, the 5600 XT was behind. However, with the new BIOS in place, the performance improvement was quite significant, and without it, the RTX 2060 would have performed better in this game. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the 5600 XT with old BIOS was a little behind the 2060 at 1080p, though it was slightly ahead at 1440p. But either way, with the update in place, it's clearly out front. In Control, the 2060 was still coming out ahead of the 5600 XT, even with the new update applied. But without the update, it would have been a much bigger loss. As I'm making this video before the launch of the 5600 XT, I don't know if all 5600 XT graphics cards will get this update. If they don't, well, as we've just seen, that kind of changes the story. Given the 5600 XT won by such a close margin in the 15 games I've tested, I wouldn't be surprised if the 2060 ended up coming out in front if we're comparing it to the original 5600 XT spec. It would have been better if AMD just took advantage of the overclocking headroom and offered this performance out of the box from the start. But instead, it looks as if they've scrambled last minute to counter the price drop of the 2060. And if customers are expected to update the BIOS on their new GPU, then that's going to be a pretty crap out-of-box experience. If they've replaced the 5600 XT cards on shelves before they went on sale with updated versions, then I've got much less of a problem with that. But yeah, right now, it's just too early for me to know. We'll have to see how things develop from here. So with all of that in mind, which would you pick? The Radeon RX 5600 XT or Nvidia RTX 2060? Let me know in the comments, and if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing for future comparisons and tech videos like this one.